Good morning. Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased that you have invited me to be a part of your conference again this year. I want to thank the wonderful people of Porto for sharing your beautiful city with us and the warm hospitality that has been shown to us. And I also congratulate Tad and Dom and the team for once again organizing a great conference. And I thank you for the strong partnership we are developing between our respective organizations, which deliver such valuable benefits to all of our members. I'm also delighted, privileged to be sharing the stage this morning with Peggy and Barbara as we talk about some of the work that we've been doing in this area of talent mobility. And to kick the session off this morning, we're going to take a look at some of the major trends that are shaping our world, the way those trends are shaping the mobility industry, and the growing importance of intercultural competencies for our leaders. So we're going to go in kind of in that order. I'm going to try and set up the framework for some of the discussions and talk about some of those mega trends that we've got going on. I'll take a quick look at these very quickly so that we get to the other parts of the presentation as well this morning. There's a very interesting book. It's called Leaders for 2030, and it has identified 5 or 6 of these mega trends. Now, some of you who may have heard me speak before about some of these things, I used to have 4, and I've probably now, after reading this book, I've added a couple of others as we talk about some of these things. But the first one is globalization 2.0. And yes, the world is global. We know that things are changing rapidly around us. But globalization 2.0 talks about a game changer. And that game changer is the development of consumer markets outside of the developed countries. We've always gone into other countries, we've put down our footprints, and we've always said, you know, you've got to play the game our way. And as you'll hear through the conversation this morning, that has now changed. We've really got to adapt to those other markets. And the reason for that is because of the explosion in those developing markets. And it's predicted by the OECD that by the year 2030, 2/3 of the middle class, the world's middle class, will be in the Asia-Pacific region. That's one of the key reasons why we need to understand how we play the game, not just on our terms any longer, but on the terms of the other countries that we're actually dealing with and working with, and collaborating with, and developing partnerships with, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The part that's really important for our discussions in that is that talent is not going to come cheaply, and it's not going to be as abundantly available as we have had in the past. And one of the reasons for that is the global phenomenon around the changing of demographics, and Peggy's going to delve into that in a little bit more detail, but I wanted to just share this with you. And as you can see from the slide here that was taken from the United Nations, which did a forecast out to 2050, all of the developed nations are in decline in terms of their population growth, including China, which has a significant challenge ahead of it because of its one-birth policy that was introduced 20 years ago. And the only real nation that we're seeing that's in the emerging areas, and look at, if you can see India there, it's a significant, the graph is going this way while we're all kind of going off of the cliff. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this graph and about how important this is, in the year 2000, 100% of graduates out of business schools in India said that they would prefer to work for a multinational corporation. That dropped to 50% in 2010. In China, between 2007 and 2010, that number dropped from 55% to 18%. So they're not as mobile. They don't want to play the game on our terms so much because their economies are also improving. The third thing that's happening is this individualism. And we're seeing this in the new generations that are entering the workforce. And as a consequence of that great growth of middle class in the emerging markets, choice is going global. You know, we've got great choices here in the developed world. Well, in the emerging markets, they now have choice. They don't necessarily want to look at just coming and living and working in the developed nations. Gen Y, according to a report issued by the Hay Group, they don't want their managers' jobs. You can take responsibility. I don't want that. What I want is self-development, achievement of my life goals, and work-life balance, but not in that order. It's life-work balance. Life comes first. And that's the third thing that's driving a lot of the change. And we're also into this digital era where we've got this emergence of technology that's making it much easier for people to work. It's transforming the way we work, how we develop and manage both our professional and personal relationships. And managers have got to get a grasp around that because it is fundamentally changing our workplaces. If you think about merging that technology and the digital era, this picture on the left with the iPhone, that's the initial release of the iPhone in, what was it, 1996 or 1997? There is 500 times more computing power in that iPhone, which was, what, generation 8? We're now at number 8, I guess, than took Apollo 11 to the moon. 500 times more computing power just in that short space of time. And so we're going to see that moving forward and influencing how we do work. And it's also shaping, that technology is also shaping what we call the knowledge-based economy. And this is changing the nature of work. You can see the little tractors at the top there, 1980 on the bottom graph and 2010. We've got a rapid shift in non-agricultural employment. More people are moving away from the farms, moving into cities, and we're creating lots more of knowledge-based jobs that require new skills, the ability to adapt to new technologies. All of that is changing the way in which we work, and not just in North America and Europe, but also in those developing nations. So we're able to harness technology in order to move more skills and upskill all of these emerging economies. Now, this is why mobility is critically important. We've got all of this change going on. We need all of these different skills, and we need these different people with these skills. And that's why we need to make sure that through our industry, through the mobility industry, that we are getting the right people in the right jobs at the right time. Challenge for us, though, as was pointed out during the introduction, is that mobility isn't for everybody. Our association in 2013, we surveyed 13,000 working people in 24 countries, and we found that just 1 in 4 of the workers said that they would likely consider a move to another country for employment. Now, that included some pretty good perks. It included a 10% raise in pay, a trip home every 2 years, and a guarantee that they could go back to their former employment. So this is the challenge that we have ahead of us. Now, I'm going to ask Peggy to dive into some of these changes a little bit more deeply and talk about the talent strategies for managing some of the key skills that we're looking for. Peggy.
Yep, thank you. Good morning. How's everybody? Really? Tad? I mean, last night, Patrick, come on.
Oh, yeah, I've nothing left to sell.
Oh my gosh, nothing left to sell. Well, come on, don't show up an American. How is everybody today? There you go. Whew! Barbara, it was a tough sled for us. I know, I'm going to try my best. So thank you all for having me as a part of this. Thank you, Tad. I'm honored. It's my first EURA, and very delighted to be able to share some thoughts with you. So Steve did a fantastic job, I think, of talking about a variety of things, and I want to pick up where he is, talk a little bit about what's going on in terms of the hearts and minds of CEOs from a lens that he shared, and then bring that all the way through into what's happening in mobility, and then pass the baton over to Barbara, who's going to talk, I think, a little bit more depth around competencies of executives. How's that sound? Good? You guys still awake? Everybody still, all right. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. You know, as Steve talked about the 5 things that CEOs, or the 6 things that he shared, this is a survey that I pulled some research from. PwC does a survey every year. It's called the CEO Annual Survey. They hit about 1,300 or so odd CEOs in 77 different countries. And these are the main themes that I pulled through from there that affect us, in addition to globalization, urbanization, a lot of the stuff that you shared, Steve. But on top of this, the key theme about this, in the interest of time, has to do with diversification. And so if you look, there's a little graphic at the top of this that talks about, you know, be like Amazon. You know, Amazon, when it started 21 years ago, everybody knew it as the e-book retailer, right? I don't think there's a soul out there today that thinks of Amazon in those circles at all. So that's one of the interesting things that go on here. When you look at some of the stuff with technology, and I picked up on Ray Hammond's comments yesterday, or whatever the day was, the opening keynote, gentlemen, I can't keep my days straight, Tad. At any rate, he talked about Uber and Airbnb, and I am an American, and so for the first time ever, Uber surpassed in New York City more than the yellow cabs. I mean, that's amazing if you think about that. So, you know, and really Uber it's a share economy kind of concept, but it's also just a technology. I mean, quite candidly, the cab and the lorry drivers around the world could have done that a long time ago had they been ahead of their game. So these are some fun things that are in the hearts and minds of CEOs. And I want to talk then a little bit about what's going on then with mature markets and where CEOs are optimistic. So the U.S. Has a little bit of an enviable position, and as CEOs put themselves and they looked at where are they looking for growth this coming year, 38% said they're looking to the United States. Now that's up 30% from last year, but you can see other economies up there that they have mentioned. You know, and over here, Germany is obviously a very robust economy that CEOs are looking for their growth in the coming year. So I think this bodes well for the overall world economy, GDP sitting globally 2.5, 2.9, 3, depending on what trade reg you look at. I won't get into a lot of GDP related things, but a lot of this ties into mobility and what's happening with talent and the shortage of talent. Does that make sense so far? So the next thing that they commented on had to do with their concerns for talent. Manpower every year for the past 5 or 6 years has released what's called a talent shortage survey, which I think by its very nature title suggests obviously there's a challenge out there that exists. So this year they have come in suggesting that 36% of global employers are having difficulty filling positions. This is up from just 32%. Now, you might look at this and think about unemployment rates, but believe it or not, Japan sits at about the highest, sitting at about 80% unemployment, or difficulty, excuse me, not unemployment, difficulty CEOs have in finding positions. But you go down, not too far down that track, believe it or not, is Greece. 59% of CEOs in Greece are having difficulty filling positions with key talent. EMEA-wide as a region sits at about 32%. If you peel back the onion in Europe specifically, or in EMEA, and say, well, what are the key areas that skills lack? It's skilled laborers is one of the top ones, salespeople. So for those of us in the room that think you might want to change, hello. Salespeople is one of the most difficult positions they have filling. And then I think this is near and dear into our industry and hearts as well. Well, maybe not quite in the DSP, but drivers. Believe it or not, drivers is one of the difficulties of positions they're having to fill. So as you talk about this, then you say, well, what's going on? And I actually think Ray stole my slide, but Ray talked about population replacement rates. And this is where then CEOs are going to have to say to themselves, where are the people? Do I move jobs to people? Do I move people to jobs? And so if you look at this, it's not surprising in the mature markets around the world, the population replacement rates are sub what they need to be. And prevailing economists will say that you need a population replacement rate of about 2.1 to keep an economically viable generation behind you. Okay, so it's not surprising in some of the underdeveloped parts of the world it's at 5.9. The flip side of this, as Ray commented on also, is the aging. And I don't know if you can see this in the back of the room, but there's a really kind of fun fact at the bottom of this, right? In Japan, that's unbelievable, right? More adult diapers are sold in Japan than baby diapers, right? And we can laugh. We're all going to be wearing Depends. Mine's going to have my name on it. I just know, and it's going to be hot by the time I get to it. But and if you look back in October, and I'll harken back to Amazon as a quick example. Amazon in October decided they're going to start to manufacture diapers, not distribute them, manufacture them. So, I mean, obviously this isn't a diaper convention here, but although in a few years it could be, right? We could be. But nonetheless, I think you have to look at this and say, well, then where is talent, and do we want to move people to those jobs and jobs to those people? So what's happening then in the HR lens with this? Well, as all these dynamics are playing forth, HR is also going through a massive transformation. And we all serve the same set of constituents, whichever way we touch them. So not that many years ago, HR was considered just personnel. It was where you got your paycheck, where you got your benefits, where you went when you were in trouble, personnel. They weren't considered strategic advisors to a business. As you look along this continuum, though, where the HR organizations need to become is to be a business strategic advisor embedded within a business unit, and not really talking about whether or not John is good or bad, but what's your people capabilities and strategies. So if I'm going to open an office in, Zimbabwe, what's the skills that are in Zimbabwe? What do I need to do? How can I achieve my business objectives? And I want to have my HR business partner with me in that meeting to discuss the people part of that aspect, rather than just bringing them in later. Now, I think this is going to continue to go along. I really do project that in the next few years, if you were to compare a job description of an HR person from today to what it's going to be in 5 years, they're not going to look at all alike. They are really moving away from some of the traditional, really super soft skills and saying we need somebody that has a fiscal acumen, a business acumen kind of lens. So then the next question is, well, where are organizations today with this? And I would just share, this is some research that was done by Bernsen, a division of Deloitte, that I think is really quite telling. If you look down at just operational reporting on this slide, 56% of us are just there. There's a long way to go. This slide suggests there's tremendous opportunity for us. If you get all the way up into predictive analytics, I don't know how prevalent Workday is over in this part of the world. People heard of Workday here? Maybe not so much. They're an up-and-coming sort of PeopleSoft kind of environment, tracking HR-related qualities, similar to LinkedIn. Well, you've heard of LinkedIn, I'm quite sure. So Jeff Weiner, their CEO, has talked about he envisions a time and a product that he's going to bring to market that's going to have predictive analytics so that he can tell you not where talent is today, but where the future it's going to be by looking at the skills that are coming up through schools. So going and looking at, who's graduating from, Oxford University or whatever, and what their skills are, so that in 4 years from now, or 3 or 2 or whatever, you will know where those skills are. So if you're looking at Zimbabwe, you can say, well, what are the skills we need and what do they have local in that market? Really getting to a place of predictive analytics in HR, which I think is tremendously exciting. They've done some groundwork already with this, and they've released some stuff in the enterprise space, so pay attention, I think, for that. So last couple of slides, and then I'll turn it over to my friend Barbara, but a couple key things within this, and I mentioned this earlier. So the HR business partner, the individual that's been out and embedded in a business unit, they've done it. You can see on this slide where they've had tremendous success driving revenue in an organization or supporting that for those companies that measure that believe in that. So I think what this suggests to us is that they are going to continue along this paradigm. You are going to continue to see HR have a more active role in a business objective. And when we talk about HR, we talk about it in this construct, meaning everything from attraction, retention, learning and development, performance management, all kinds of fun things. But mobility is part of that too. And the great news about mobility in this particular space is we are so unique in that we're the one aspect of HR that touches all of them. Comp and benefits is deep and it's drilled down. You know, you've got other areas of HR, performance management, but in mobility, we have the privilege and the honor to be a part of all of that, including immigration and other areas. So I think it's a fantastic time for us and a fantastic time for us to make ourselves our own Uber and do some things that really progress up in that particular space. Finally, my last slide on all this, CEOs recognize the importance of mobility, yet this is very sobering. 75% say that they know mobility needs to be an important part of their function, but only 2% believe they have a world-class function in their own organization. So I believe that it's important for us to not only raise the profile of what HR is doing, but help raise the profile and the competencies of what we need to bring along in the case of mobility. So I've given you, an hour-long presentation in about 8 minutes because Steve's given me the stink eye over here. And let me turn it over to my friend Barbara, who's going to take us through competencies.
Thanks, Peggy.
You bet. Thank you.
Good morning. Warmed him up well. Thank you. First I have to do the anti-selfie. Everybody smile, please. Okay. So my background is in corporate communication. Had 25 years in in the field of public relations and corporate comms. And a few years ago, I had the opportunity to serve as chair of the International Association of Business Communicators. And in that role, I was traveling the world and being exposed to so many more cultures than I ever had. And I really developed a desire to understand it better and went back to school at the ripe old age of almost 50 and did a PhD in intercultural communication. My background, again, for the last decade or so, had been working at the CEO level. And I had worked with global companies, and what I saw was actually, it seemed like they didn't get it at the top. They weren't as successful in their non-domestic markets as they thought they should be. And my kind of diagnosis at the time, which was just a hunch, was actually ethnocentricity rolls downhill from the top of the organization. And so I started out to explore that, to see what is the research out there, because certainly this field has been researched like crazy, right? You're all familiar with research around intercultural competencies. Actually, though, what I found was it hadn't kept up. And what I found was the whole world of global business had changed dramatically. In the 20th century paradigm, you didn't really start going global until you were a giant domestic player, right? So you can think of some of those brands from any country. And they very gradually, sometimes over decades, began to go global. And it was a fairly small percentage of their business, so there was very little risk involved, so they could afford to get it wrong and learn as they go. And in that paradigm, too, most of the top team was all the same culture. So if you were a Japanese company, everybody on your top team was Japanese. Certainly the CEO was. If you were an American company, everybody for several layers down the management chain was American. That has really changed. And the problem is the research in this field is still most of it based on that 20th century model. And what I found was that now, actually, many more, since about the last 15 years, many more companies are born global. Meaning, within the first 1 to 3 years of startup, they're already doing business beyond their domestic borders. They're expanding really rapidly. They're small, and so it's a much bigger percentage of their assets, time, attention are going into non-domestic markets, which means it's much higher risk. They can't afford to get it wrong for years and learn little by little. And so their needs have changed. Again, research hasn't kept up with that. And also in this model, because it's smaller companies, the intercultural competencies are actually needed at the top. So 20 years ago, it probably wasn't necessary for the CEO of a giant global multinational to have intercultural competencies themselves. All they needed was for their mid-level managers that they were sending off to different countries had to have that, right? Now you need it at the top because it's affecting your own performance, your own organization's success. I also found, I gave a new category to this, and I call it the millennial globals. So these are very large established businesses of the 20th century, but they didn't begin to go global until after the turn of the century. And their needs, I found, are actually almost identical to the born globals. So it's not just size of company, it's when did you start? Because the whole world, because of the internet, has changed in what the needs are. So there's also increasingly, even in the business research fields, you can start seeing companies are realizing that they need to have that global experience at the top of the organization, though many of them don't still. And so they're beginning to hire CEOs who have international experience, I think because they think it's a proxy for actual intercultural competencies. The research tells us actually it's not. So you can have lived abroad, worked abroad, and actually not have developed any particular competencies that have helped. But as a proxy, it's one way to do it. But there is some research that tells us that the amount of international experience in your top management team, I refer to it as TMT, actually impacts business success. So they've looked at companies that have that experience and their financial performance. So it becomes much more important. If we don't have that experience, if we've got lots of ethnocentric top managers, we're not going to perform as well. So that brings me to my research where I started looking at, so what exactly do global CEOs today need to be successful outside their domestic markets? And, oh boy, those shrunk a lot. I set out to basically find out first, do CEOs even think that culture comes into play at their level, at the strategic level, not further down the management chain? And if so, what areas of their own business, their day-to-day work, does culture come into play? And then what competencies do they need to deal with those areas? I also looked at how we could assess those, because there are lots of assessment tools developed mostly with students or expat managers to assess intercultural competencies, and I wanted to see, are those valid at the CEO level? I tended to think not, based on the tools that I looked at. And then, if they don't have those competencies, can they be developed? How are the best ways? So at the CEO level, I looked at how did they, if they had them, how did they develop them throughout their career? And my research methodology was 28 CEO interviews, companies from all over, not all over the world, 12 different countries, and they ranged from very, very tiny born global companies to 200,000 employees. They ranged in age from kind of mid-30s to over 60, and male, female, not quite the balance I would like, but the one that is in reality. About half of my sample were born globals. And I did in-depth interviews, getting them to tell me stories of where culture comes into play, their own experiences, what goes wrong, what goes right. So we found 5 areas that were clearly had major business impact among the sample. And that the top one, by far, was managing their top team, because now they're managing diversity. So it wasn't even down to the rank and file of the organization. It was, how do I motivate this guy who's from a culture I don't understand what motivates you, right? It's the getting along of that top team. It's their being effective. Lots of issues with how to build trust when you're working cross-culturally. Conflict and negotiation came up throughout it, and this was really key because that's where they tended to get blindsided by cultural differences and have a spectacular failure before they even knew what had happened. Decision making, not only about making the right decisions in going into different markets, but also decision-making style. For instance, in some countries that are very hierarchical, the top guy makes the decision and everybody just carries it out. In other cultures, it's much more about consensus, and that's very difficult to change your style. Hiring was a really big one. One of my CEOs said, the ability to hire the right people to run my business in foreign markets is my single biggest barrier to global success. That's pretty strong. And then ethical issues came up quite a lot. On a smaller scale, we also saw partners and vendors, which were the same issues really as managing. So whether you're outsourcing it or in-house, the same issues came up. Going into new markets, dealing with change, mergers and acquisitions clearly is an ongoing problem, whether you're doing mergers and acquisitions in a single culture or cross-culturally, they tend to fail quite often. And then regulatory, government, legal issues as well. So in those areas of business impact then, what are the competencies they need to be more successful? And there were 5 that emerged from it. The first, adaptability. And in this case, in the old paradigm, when it was more about moving to a foreign country, being a fish out of water, it was about adapting to one culture. But anybody working in a truly global role is about adapting as the need arises. And so it's the ability to adapt your communication style or your strategies or your behavior in order to meet the needs of the situation. Cultural self-awareness. A lot of the training that we provide to people going abroad is around the other. What do I need to know about them? Actually, we need to know about ourselves. It's understanding our own cultural biases and our influences, and also how we may be perceived by those of other cultures. I'm originally American, so I have to know that most of the world thinks Americans are obnoxious and loud. It's just really important to see that. So cultural self-awareness. A new term that I developed called cultural sensory perception. And the closest thing in the existing literature usually is referred to as something like cultural sensitivity. But that has been misinterpreted so much that it's come to mean something like political correctness or don't offend the natives. Completely wrong. You will. We will make mistakes. We will offend the locals. Actually, what I'm talking about is the ability to sense when what's going wrong here is cultural. And that means being able to not only understand it in the language, but to read between the lines, to read body language. Body language that, by the way, may be completely different to what you're used to seeing. So it's being able to sense. And again in the CEOs that had it in my study, they'd talk about it and they didn't necessarily even know how they sensed it. It was just about kind of reading people. So developing that ability to spot it. And that way, you may not have all the knowledge, but you can go off and figure it out and then adapt. So really key to have that before you could adapt. Open-mindedness, in this case, that's just being able to kind of delay a judgment, to set it aside while you pay attention to your own cultural biases and examine it from different points of view. And finally, global perspective, which is about kind of being able to see your company not as an American company or a Japanese company, but as truly transnational. So I set out to find those things. I was looking for those first 2 answers. What I didn't set out to look for is how they responded when things went wrong. So I'm analyzing the data, I'm reading the transcripts again and again, and I spotted a pattern. And the first one I spotted was a CEO that in every story he told me, basically when something would go wrong, he would keep doing the same thing. Years at a time sometimes. So this may be familiar to you. I think about it as the tourist, the English-speaking tourist who goes abroad and no one understands him, and they just talk louder, right? So I said, this is a pattern. I'm going to go back and look at all the data and see if I can see other patterns. And what I found is something I've called the response to failure conceptual framework. And I explain it like this. So you start with a strategy, and that could be anything from a real business strategy to just a conversational strategy of do I shake hands or do I bow, and getting that right or wrong. And in any case, you might succeed, you might fail. The reality is that in an intercultural interaction, there's much more possibility that whatever strategy we choose won't be right because we may not have all the information. The pattern that we would follow is if it succeeds, we will keep repeating that until it doesn't, right? That's very normal. But what I found was if they had the intercultural competencies required in this situation, they were much more likely to be able to adapt and get to a success and then repeat that pattern until it failed. The other pattern, which I just mentioned, was, well, that didn't work, I'll keep doing it because I must be right. And of course, that leads back to a failure and stays in that loop. And sometimes in several of the instances in the data, it happened for a year or more at a time. We just keep doing it because we know we're right. But that's not the worst pattern. I also found one that I call RTF abandon. So that didn't work. We'll just try something new. The people who did this thought they were adapting, but the difference that I saw was there were no learning or insights happening. So that didn't work. I'll try something new, but I have no idea why that didn't work. I didn't have the cultural sensory perception to even grasp that it was cultural. And these people spend a lot of time maybe getting it right, maybe getting it wrong, but not really understanding, so it can't become a pattern to repeat for success. Still not the worst one. The very worst pattern I saw was, well, that didn't work. We'll never go back to Italy again. Or I'm pulling out of France, right? So in this case, one of the best examples was a research company CEO who said in her industry, the leaders had begun to outsource a portion of the research work to India. Not only for lower costs, but also to take advantage of the rolling time clock so they could get things done for their clients overnight. And so she followed the leaders. She invested a huge amount of money, 6 months of her time, finding the right partners, training them on her procedures, and she, for cultural reasons, just couldn't manage them. They just can't meet our needs kind of attitude. And so she said, well, that just didn't work. And I said, so what did you do? She said, well, we just don't outsource anymore. We decided that can't meet our needs. So millions actually spent and abandoned. That's in a business sense, the worst possible pattern to have. And it was one that she'd actually repeated in a number of areas. So, and what I believe is that you can then see those patterns not only at the individual level, but sometimes at the company level. And if you can then diagnose and work on specific competencies to help them develop, you can get them back to a success pattern. So how do you develop those competencies? Whenever in the interviews that I was doing, when the CEOs would indicate that they'd figured something out, that they got it right after struggling with it, I would poke at that. And it's how did you know? What changed? And that's how I got to how did they actually develop them through the years. And the number one was their own experience living and working abroad. So this is key in attracting people to take those mobility assignments, is that that's the only way they'll ever be a good global executive. But there's a great big asterisk here, because the ones who were good at it said, but don't stay in an expat bubble. Don't do the comfortable thing. And I think that's where there's some tension between the role that many of you have in terms of making the individual assignment successful, making them comfortable, and actually helping them develop. They will develop more if they get outside that bubble. Also, mentoring and coaching was really key. Training hardly showed up at all. So it's the ongoing development that's necessary, somebody to hold that mirror up and say, this is actually how we see you. So whether that was formal or informal, that was really important. Multicultural relationships and friendships. So again, not staying with just people like ourselves, getting out and experiencing and having, in an informal way, getting that feedback you need. And then foreign travel, of course, shows up as, especially for those who hadn't had extensive assignments abroad, and also working in culturally diverse teams, really good way. So again, there's research that says sometimes culturally diverse teams are less efficient than others at solving the problems, doing what they're supposed to do. But if you're thinking about developing those competencies long term, you need to abandon efficiency and go for doing it the hard way, because that's how people learn. I've provided some resources that you can get the slides later if you want to do further reading, and my contact information. And also, there's a link to my full research report if anybody's interested. Thank you so much for letting me be part of it, and I'll turn over to you to take questions if we've got time.
Thank you so much. So now we come to the fun part, and we rushed through a lot of the information in the first part of the morning, so that we want to make this as interactive as possible. Do we have a roving? Great, okay. And so I will ask if there are any questions. Yeah, okay. Thank
you.
Would you just say who you are for us?
Good morning. My name is Andrea Massoud, and I'm from Brazil, representing Living in Brazil company. And you are great, the three of you. So I always start appreciating, and it added a lot. It added a lot. Now, for me, Barbara is new, because I've known, we work together, and I've known you. But I want to address a question to Barbara. It's a great study, and if we analyze, how things are, and self-actualization is really with the CEOs, it seems to me when we do the Maslow thing, as if we are going back to basics, and we need to do it upside down, because we are really addressing the global on the top, the global aspect on the top, which is the CEO. And it seems to me, the lack of humility, and speaking from the heart, it's where stop them from going back to basics and seeing where people are coming from. So I don't know. So this first question is, how many spoke to you out of their heart and saying how resilient they were and how they took it? That is one thing. The other thing is, when we work with them, they always say, I don't need anything because I speak English. And I don't need anything because I always conduct business and I stay in hotels. And my kids go to one own cultural, nationality school. So I don't see anybody go in and say, let me mingle with the locals, because for me to be global, I need to go local. All of them want to know where the expat community is, the international school, and not learning language, because they don't need to learn the local language, because if they are top, everybody speaks to them in their own language.
Yeah.
So it's many things happening. And when we are talking about recruiting and selection, so when you interview people and they say in their resume, I've been here, I've been there, I've conducted business. Nobody says about that failure that you put.
Yeah.
Nobody. So, and when this interview happens, is you select these people based on the geography they have been to. But there is the stereotype out of it. You don't know if someone is coming and giving you feedback of the bad experience they've got, because that goes into stereotypes.
Yeah.
So it's really complex. It's how can we filter that, not to fall into this bias and hiring people that only have been there,
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
So there were a lot of questions in that. And I'm not sure now I'll remember them all. I'll start with the end one. For interviewing, I think you can't just use international experience as a proxy. It's a good kind of first starting point. But what you want to do is asking questions about when things went wrong. because it doesn't matter if they've made mistakes, it's did they learn something from it, right? So that tells you a lot about their cultural sensory perception. It tells you a lot about their adaptability. And so I think the same methodology that I used in my interviewing would work in interviewing for those kind of opportunities. I also, as I was in each of my interviews, kind of my closing question was, if you were hiring someone for your role, what would you be looking for to be sure that they had the intercultural competencies needed? And got some really good answers. And a lot of them, it was about if they lived abroad, who were their friends? What did they do? How did they spend their off time? But also, I think more and more, and in my CEO sample, a number of them were third culture kids themselves. So they had their own mix of cultures. Many of them had moved outside their home culture at a very young age. And those were much more likely to have really high levels of cultural sensory perception. And so my theory on this is being an outsider at an early age helps you develop those skills naturally. The later in life you get exposed to other cultures, the less likely you are, the more likely you are to want to stay in a bubble, in the expat bubble, and be sure that you're right and they're wrong. And so, with the CEOs that I worked with, it was about their early experiences. Most of them were multilingual. There seemed to be a little bit of a age-related difference, so that if they were in large companies, they had fewer languages. But the really hot, really interculturally competent CEOs in my study, most had experience very young, and most didn't see themselves as only one culture. They were in themselves multicultural. Yeah, and I think that's the key. So again, kind of get people interested in taking those assignments now. It's about their own opportunity to grow, because that's going to be the future. You won't be able to be the CEO with one language or one set of competencies.
And I think that's a really good way for, as you're trying, you've raised a really good question, and taking people out of their comfort zone. But I think that's a really great point, is for you folks to use with those kinds of questions that you get. Well, look, Mr. Big Shot, it's not all about you, but, the experience that your children will have by becoming more ingrained in the local culture and so on, it will equip them for what the new world holds. And by the way, I've got some research here that was done by Dr. Barbara Gibson that supports that. Other points? Come on, we had a good discussion yesterday in the DSP session where we talked about the importance of intercultural.
No, I was just wondering, you based this on whatever it was, 28 people. If you were to take those 28 people and kind of multiply them across the world, what percentage of CEOs would have what you consider to be tolerable cultural sensitivity?
Currently, especially in the large 20th century ones, I would say it's a very small percentage. As those CEOs move on, now the recruiters and the boards are looking for higher levels. But because most of the research has been at the expat manager level, there aren't tools out there for assessing. The people doing the interviewing don't necessarily know how to do that well. So I think it's a field that will become much more important, and you'll see much more growing up at the top management team looking for those capabilities.
So Peggy, I have a question in terms of making this bridge between the things that we've spoken about this morning, and how do we equip our industry to assist that transition for mobility to be more of a strategic business partner. And the research is there. I mean, there's a thirst for this. There's work that's been done by PwC. There's been work that's been done by Ernst & Young. and even in our own surveys that we've done within the Canadian landscape, where mobility managers currently, they say that they are operating at a transaction, that they're spending a lot of time in that day-to-day space, but in 2 years from now, they expect that they will be fulfilling that role as being more of a strategic business partner and focusing on business outcomes. But how do we make that possible? How can we help them to achieve that? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll share. I actually want to get futurologist after my name because in case I screw this up, I can still stay on the payroll somewhere. But I'll share two pivots on this. One pivot is I think it's going to happen a little bit organically from Generation Z, which is 0 to 18-year-olds. And they are the ones that are going to be embarking upon the workforce in about 4 years. So this particular group of people, much like what Barbara chatted about, they want to be global. And so I think by the very nature of, if you go back to the war for talent issues that are out there, in order for companies to attract that youth and that innovation, they're going to have to make mobility within the organization be more strategic. And I'll give a really quick example on that, and then I'll talk about the current state as well. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned Workday, again, an HRIS system started in the Bay Area. They were recognizing how difficult it was for them to attract talent. So they created what's called Sprint to Ireland. And so every employee that they hire is guaranteed 2 weeks of time in Ireland. That was compelling enough for some of the youth, some of this Generation Z or even the millennials, to say, I want to go work there because I am guaranteed to go work in Ireland, which is where Workday has another location, for 2 weeks. So you're seeing this real energy around, it's more important for me to have a global resume. And I think you're going to see them want to be more local in that global environment than expat. So I think the very nature of the youth that are coming through is going to create some of that. But where do you do in our current state? I firmly believe that we have got to collectively help move our conversation from being we're an expense, it was $1 million to send somebody on assignment, to what revenue support objectives did we help? And when you can change that conversation, you become more valuable to a business. And I think businesses are recognizing that they want to do this. We haven't created that nice sort of storybook business case. And there are some real natural industries for this. If you're in petrochemical, if you're in pharma, those are two ones that I think are super easy because you're typically sending somebody to do drilling somewhere. Well, you're going to have them drill and you're hoping to get X, Y, or Z revenue out of that particular well. Well, why don't you come back and say, well, we sent John over to, wherever, and it cost us $2 million, but you know what? He was instrumental in helping drive revenue in that market for $20 billion. We haven't told that story.
Yeah,
we have to own telling that.
Yeah, we haven't. I mean, what we found through, and, in both of our associations and a lot of the work that's done, is that companies, they put, as you said, they put $1 million in terms of sending somebody on an assignment, but they don't do the return on investment of that $1 million. They don't look as to whether or not they really are sending the right person out, and I think this is why the work that you're doing in this area, Barbara, and I think it's going to be increasingly a significant factor in determining the business outcomes. But about less than 10%, roughly, in all of if you look at any of the literature, less than 10% of the companies today have a robust methodology in place in order to determine what the return on investment of an ROI is. And I know that, in this part of the industry, we struggle with that, right? To try and figure out, well, how do we? You talked yesterday in the discussions yesterday about, a race to the bottom, about, just trying to cut cost in terms of trying to get the assignment, or the work. But that's not helping the outcome on that business process, right? I mean, yes, you might be cutting costs and so on, but you're not helping that family, that group integrate. Patrick.
Yeah, you're quite right, Steve. I always love the way this figure, $1 million to send somebody abroad, is plucked
To
out of
Ireland.
the air. By the way, the people who come to Ireland for a fortnight don't get anything like that. This $1 million figure, it always comes up. And you know, if they just spend 10% of that on destination services, we'd make sure that those people got the intercultural competencies that they need. You know, the actual percentage that's spent with our people here in the room is so tiny of that $1 million that it is hard to give them what they really need. And we are the people who can really give it to them because we're there.
Absolutely. I think we've got common agreement on that. And I think one of the challenges is, to your point, Peggy, what's the storybook?
Yeah.
We have to create that storybook.
Well, we do need to tell the story, and one of the stories that I love to tell is when I started going to ERC, which was before your time, Peggy. I loved hearing all of these, especially the sort of research that you come up with, Barbara. I used to love hearing that, and just wish that it wasn't so convincing, because I needed the people to come from the United States, fail and get sent back and be replaced. That was the way I thought. I was a bit cynical at the time. But now I see that the people that are moving are the ones that have that intercultural and global type that are moving, not just from the States, but moving all around the world all the time. And that's what's feeding our business. So I think the future is pretty safe, and that we're not dependent on the ones that don't get it. We have a whole generation now who do, and they're our customers, and it's a great pleasure to serve them.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Patrick. Barbara, I have a quick question for you. You looked at this as for CEOs that are currently out there, and what was going through my mind. And one of the comments in your paper was the importance of training people before they go. How do we train our future leaders around this? I mean, yeah, they're going to be more amenable to perhaps the training, as Peggy says, but what do we need to be doing from an industry perspective?
Yeah,
Real quick.
I think that training per se, or the way it's been done, is not the answer alone. Training, especially pre-assignment, can be a good first step, but everything that I saw said that actually it's about mentoring and coaching, and it has to be ongoing when they're in country, because you don't just learn it cognitively, you have to be able to apply it, you have to be able to fail and see those patterns. So I think much more emphasis on a long-term support for those people when they're in the assignments.
Great. Yeah, and as you're just teeing that up, Manny, could you just flip up the last slide for us, please? Go ahead, real quick. Okay, we've got just...
Well, we're running out of time a little bit, but a quick one.
Yeah, the three tips from the three. Because the three of you travel a lot and work a lot in different arenas, and you communicate a lot. So, like, tips from you is like for you not to get that bias and stereotype inside yourself, and then you start saying, oh, this behavior is cultural. And then you ended up, because you want to be empathetic, that everything is cultural. And we know everything is not cultural. Some things are individuals. How can you sense and prepare yourself when you see something and you say, this must not be cultural, this is individual, it's like rude, inadequate. How can you do this? You know?
I pay attention, and with my students, to pay attention to those little voices in your head that's saying that's rude, because most of the time, rude or deceptive is actually cultural. It's somebody who's on the spectrum of indirect versus direct communication styles is on the opposite end of you. So if they're direct communicators and you're an indirect communicator, they sound rude all the time. And so it's not just that they said that. We put intent. So he intended to be rude when actually it wasn't the case. So, I mean, I may be like somebody who has a hammer and thinks everything is a nail, but I really think much of it is cultural. And so being aware of your own biases, pay attention to that little voice, and at least take time to examine it from a different point of view.
Yeah, and I just offer this just real quickly. So how many in the audience have ever heard of Johari's window? Yeah, okay. So as soon as I explain this, it'll make a lot of sense. Johari's window is basically a window, and it's got, the way to think about it is there's 4 quadrants in it, and one is the things about me that you and I both see. The other is the things about me that I see that you don't see. The other are the things about me that you see that I don't see, and the fourth is the things about me that neither of us see. So I don't have that strong intuitive sense. I won't know if I've offended Barbara because I just don't. That doesn't work in. Why did I share that? Because you have to have somebody that you trust and that is a trusted advisor to you that can point out the things to you that you don't see. So Barbara can say, you know, Peggy, when you stood up and said hi to that European audience, they really just wanted you to get on with it, right? So you have to have that. So for me, Andrea, I'm not going to be able to bring it in naturally because I'm going to think, well, I don't understand why they didn't smile back at me. Well, you know what? You need somebody to come and say, well, here's why. And so so I've learned to fill my bucket by surrounding myself with people who will be brutally honest and tell me I look fat in my dress, because that's what you need.
And the problem is, by the time you get to the CEO level, nobody's telling you the truth anymore.
But you have to build that network. No, you can't be, yeah.
But almost every CEO in my sample either had or currently had a coach. Not necessarily cultural, but so they do believe in coaching at a senior level, and so maybe that's the key is they'll pay someone to tell them the things that no one else will tell them.
Great. For me, I think it's about honesty and trying to figure out the lens. Like, don't think about it just from I'm transmitting this information, but how are those people going to see what? Somebody said it great yesterday, and I'm not. Think about it as from the lens from the other side, I think was the phrase that was used, and I thought, hey, that's so. Sorry to be rude, but we are absolutely way over time, and I do appreciate the participation that we've had this morning. There were 5 key pieces, I think, that we said in terms of the demands on our future leaders. Tad will make this. You've got this now to get through and put on your site. So these are some of the things that if you reflect back on the discussions that we had this morning from the globalization 2.0 right through how are we going to attract, retain, and deploy the talent and also prepare our future leaders. These are some of the things that I think we've talked about this morning. So I do appreciate your time, and thank you very much, Peggy. Thank you very much, Barb. It's been a pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.